there! Thanks for listening to Let's Talk Withdrawal, a weekly discussion on antidepressants and the issues surrounding them.
Hello, my name is James and welcome to episode 4 of Let's Talk Withdrawal, a new weekly podcast discussing antidepressants. Before we get started, I just want to thank you for getting in touch and sharing your feedback. We'll be going through some of the feedback later on. But first, I'm honoured to have had the chance to interview Professor Peter Gøtzsche. Professor Gøtzsche graduated as a Master of Science in Biology and Chemistry in 1974 and as a physician in 1984. He has worked with clinical trials and regulatory affairs in the drug industry and at hospitals in Copenhagen. He co-founded the Cochrane Collaboration and established the Nordic Cochrane Centre in 1993. In 2010, he became Professor of Clinical Research Design and Analysis at the University of Copenhagen. Peter has published more than 70 papers in the mainstream medical journals, and his scientific works have been cited more than 15,000 times. He is also an author, and his books include Deadly Medicines and Organised Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare, published in 2013, and in 2015 he published Deadly Psychiatry and Organised Denial. I was keen to talk to Professor Gøtzsche about his background in research, his views on antidepressant prescribing, and how pharmaceutical manufacturers have influenced mental health care. Thank you for talking to us, Professor Gøtzsche. Firstly, for the listeners, could you give us a bit about your background and how you came to be interested in issues around psychiatric medication?
I first became a biologist and didn't know what to do, so my grandfather, who was a general practitioner, suggested me to go into the drug industry, which I did. And I had not been there long before I realized that I needed to get out of that. I didn't know much about drugs at that time, but I quickly realized that the drug companies were manipulating the science and they were manipulating, of course, the truth when they marketed the drugs. So that's the reason I started to study medicine while I still worked in the drug industry. I have worked in many different areas in healthcare and became involved in psychiatry 10 years ago when a person I knew wanted to do a PhD with me where she compared benzodiazepines with antidepressant drugs. She wanted to see if history repeated itself, and very sadly, it really did repeat itself. It took 20 years before it was admitted that benzodiazepines make people dependent. And we have seen the same story with SSRIs, where the authorities and the psychiatrists and the drug companies, of course, denied that you become dependent on these drugs, and they denied it also for about 20 years. Even the UK drug regulator denied this in 2003, at the same time as the World Health Organization reported that 3 antidepressant drugs were in top 30 of drugs for which drug dependence had ever been reported. So this is just outrageous. And if you ask the patients in studies, then half of them, or sometimes 2/3 of them, will say that they become dependent on antidepressant drugs. And we also know what the abstinence symptoms are. So she did a PhD about that, which was immensely unpopular with 2 of her 3 examiners. They wanted to turn down her PhD for no good reason. But luckily, the 3rd PhD examiner was David Healy, psychiatrist in Wales, and he could not see why it should be turned down. So I contacted the university, and she had done good studies and she got her PhD. But this tells you how the system is working, that when you come with unwelcome truth, the system will try to come after you.
It is shocking, and I'm so grateful to you and Dr. Healy and Professor Reed and others for being willing to go against the mainstream to point out the risks and the dangers involved in these medications.
Yes, there are very few people who stand up.
I can't imagine for a minute that that's a comfortable place to be.
Well, somehow you get used to it, and the sense of justice is a strong motivator for not only humans but also the big apes. So when you see injustice, some of us just can't help it. We want to fight it, no matter the cost for ourselves. We don't think about the cost.
I imagine that it must have helped your research work to have inside knowledge on the inner workings of pharmaceutical manufacturers. Is that the case?
Oh, it makes a huge difference, although it's now more than 30 years ago I left the drug industry. It made a big impression on me that never leaves me. So I remember quite well how drug companies function. They sell drugs and they don't really care about whether people die in the process as long as it doesn't become a major issue on the front pages of newspapers.
It's so worrying, isn't it, that a manufacturer of a product that has these attendant risks can adopt such a carefree attitude to people's health and well-being.
Yes, that's why in my first book about the drug industry I published 5 years ago, which I was very happy won the first prize from the British Medical Association in the category Basis of Medicine, that already on the first page I compare the drug industry to the tobacco industry, because in both industries people are completely cynical. It doesn't matter that these industries kill millions of people. They just accept it.
I agree, and the other similarity between them is that they are almost actively encouraging dependence because it guarantees their future profits.
That's certainly correct, and I have now studied psychoactive drugs for 10 years, and it's probably the case that all of these drugs can make you dependent because they change something in your brain, and then the brain tries to react against these changes. So when you suddenly take away the drug, it is like if an alcoholic has no longer any alcohol. That's not good.
Well, I can certainly confirm that this is a situation that applies to me and many people that I have spoken with. Peter, I wanted to ask, you've previously said that prescription drugs are now the third leading cause of death behind heart disease and cancer. What is it, do you think, that has gone so wrong in our healthcare system for this to be the case?
What has gone terribly wrong is that we have allowed the drug industry to be our masters and not our servants. They have so much money, and they try to buy everybody with an influence, and they do very well in that respect. They have professors on their advisory boards and as consultants and all the rest of it, and they have the politicians with them. In countries like the UK and Denmark, we earn a good deal of money by exporting drugs to other countries. So the politicians won't touch their drug industries, and they have become too big to fail now. That's like if the mafia has become too big in a city and they have corrupted everybody, including the sheriff and the mayor and leading politicians, then it becomes very difficult to do anything about it. And since there is so much propaganda out there from the drug industry, people tend to believe propaganda. If you have heard a lie many times, you end up believing this lie. So the whole system is corrupt, which is illustrated by the fact that our drugs are the third major killer. And I have done similar estimates on psychiatric drugs, and they might be exaggerated, but I looked for the best science I could find, and I actually came up with a similar estimate for psychiatric drugs alone, that they might also be the third major killer. But there is no doubt about that psychiatric drugs have killed millions of people over the years. And one mechanism that people rarely think about is that when you get a little older, anything that affects your brain can affect your balance. And if you fall and break your hip, 20% will be dead within the next year. So this is a major reason why antidepressant drugs and all other psychoactive drugs, they kill quite a number of people in that phase of their lives. And if we look at antidepressant drugs, it's absolutely absurd that we use these drugs, although they actually increase the risk of suicide in all ages, then we use them in people who are depressed. It makes absolutely no sense. And psychotherapy has a marked effect on the risk of suicide. Psychotherapy reduces the risk of suicide. And what do? We use pills. It is so insane as it can get.
It is shocking, isn't it? Because again, my own experience is that as soon as you mention depression or anxiety to a doctor, the most common reaction is to reach for the prescription pad before asking you what's happened in your life, or would therapy help you, or even what about your nutrition or your social life? The prescribing of antidepressants seems to be the path of least resistance.
Yes, it's completely like Pavlov's dog, that when you ring a bell, they start salivating because they have learned that ringing a bell means food. And unfortunately, my colleagues, they have these reflexes that a patient turns up with a problem. Oh, you're depressed. Oh, we have a pill for you. They have learned that from the drug industry and from the psychiatrists who are supposed to be specialists in this. But the really sad thing is that many leading psychiatrists try to tell us that antidepressants protect against suicide, which is absolutely wrong and dangerous to say. And they also have this idea that antipsychotic drugs are good for people. They are not. The patients don't like them, and the drugs make it much more difficult for the patients to think, to function, to work, to have sex, anything. And it makes it more difficult for them to come back to a normal life, which has been shown in many, many studies now. So if you ask me, I think we could do well without using antipsychotics at all. If patients are severely disturbed and cannot sleep, they can get a sleeping pill instead. And actually, this is also what the patients want. I have often asked patients when I lecture, and all of them so far have wanted a benzodiazepine if they should become psychotic one more time and not an antipsychotic. So why don't we let the patients do what they want most and what is actually most beneficial for them? It makes absolutely no sense to me.
And Peter, related to that, I wanted to know what your thoughts were on what we could do to improve the safety of the prescribing of psychiatric medications.
There is virtually nothing you can do because the industry is so powerful. And the psychiatrists have created a fantasy land of their own where they propagate false ideas to each other and more or less believe in those false ideas. And why do they do that? Well, they were in big trouble in the 80s and the 70s because therapists, psychologists and others were their competitors on the market. And the only thing that distinguished them from psychologists was the right to prescribe drugs. So this foolish idea that people are ill because they have a chemical imbalance, which is one of the biggest lies in psychiatry, it is still being propagated everywhere. And this is very beneficial for the psychiatrists, but harmful for their patients. So we need a revolution in psychiatry where psychiatrists should use drugs so little that I'm only talking about in acute situations for a few days and not against the patient's will. We must get rid of forced treatment. And then they will have to relearn psychotherapy and take an interest in the patient's history. It's often trauma that are behind when people become psychotic, but nowadays, very often psychiatrists don't get the history. They just ask for some symptoms and there you have an antipsychotic pill and you get a diagnosis. To me, this is bad medicine, very bad medicine.
I agree. It is difficult to see what else we can do about the situation other than to raise awareness so that hopefully patients can themselves make a more informed choice about treatment.
That's exactly why I'm so happy to contribute to what you are doing. Peter Gøtzsche, U.S. psychiatrist in New York State, has said that if you have a problem, a mental health problem, then don't go and see a psychiatrist. That's too dangerous. And I agree with him. We have a whole specialty that does more harm than good because they use and advocate psychiatric drugs far too much. I don't know of any other specialty in healthcare that does more harm than good. It's really, really tragic. And the way to go against this is not hoping that they can reform themselves. That will not happen. We need to tell the public how bad it is and need to tell them to stay away from psychiatric drugs.
Well, certainly, I'm really grateful to you, Dr. Healy, Professor Reed, and the others for being willing to talk to me about this so that patients can really understand the full story. I didn't understand that story when 4 years ago I went to my GP and had the standard discussion about, you have a chemical imbalance, here's an antidepressant, you'll probably have to take it for life, and it's like insulin for a diabetic. I walked away with those tablets not realizing that I wasn't being told anything like the truth.
You know, I think it should be seen as a criminal act to tell patients a huge lie about a chemical imbalance and then telling them that they should take an antidepressant for the rest of their lives. I really think that this should end up in court. It is totally unethical and unacceptable.
It is, and it's disturbing how often these reasons are used to justify antidepressant treatment. In the UK, we've prescribed 63 million antidepressants in a single year, a doubling in a decade, with many patients taking more than one drug at a time. No doubt there's a similar picture in other countries. What do you believe is driving this increase?
It can be said in 3 words. Follow the money.
Thank you. That's brilliantly succinct and clear. Would you agree that we seem to have a mental health care system that's driven primarily by profit margin rather than patient well-being?
Yes. Psychiatrists should be awarded according to the number of patients they make well again. Then perhaps they would become more interested in psychotherapy again.
And looking to the future, in an ideal world, if you had the chance to sweep away the dangerous drugs and the risks and the myths, what would you recommend as the best approach for someone who wanted to get help for their mental health?
Well, we can't get away with all the lies. They will always be there. But if people have problems with mental health, they should either see a good psychologist or another good therapist or a good psychiatrist who has understood that pills are only for emergency situations and only if the patient wants a pill for a short period of time. I know excellent psychiatrists in several countries who never use psychiatric drugs.
Thank you. And Peter, are there any other issues that you'd like to make the listeners aware of?
The most important thing is avoid psychiatric drugs unless it is for a very short period of time and you are yourself deciding that this is what you want and only for acute situations.
Thank you. That will help people understand. I think the general view in the UK is that an antidepressant is a magic pill that will lift your mood, and there's little awareness about the adverse reactions, the difficulties with withdrawal and dependence, the fact that the drugs wash out, so another antidepressant has to be added on top. These are things that are not well understood. I also wonder what you felt about antidepressant efficacy.
When you look carefully at the randomized trials where people got an antidepressant drug or a placebo, it turns out that these drugs are not even working for depression. It's only the psychiatrists that say they work, whereas their patients in the same trials say that they don't work. And the psychiatrists are subjective because they have guessed often who gets placebo and who gets an active drug because of the drug's side effects. So if you really look carefully through the randomized trials, you come to the conclusion that these drugs don't work. People should know that they will become better in some weeks' time, even if they're not treated at all. But if they get a drug, many people and doctors believe that this is because of the drug that they become better. That is not true. It is nature that heals the depression. The drugs don't have a meaningful effect for patients. So don't get on these drugs.
Peter, I think I'm right in saying that I recently read a Cochrane Centre produced meta-analysis involving 27,422 patients taking SSRIs. Could you tell us about that piece of work?
You are right. It was a huge meta-analysis of 131 trials that came out last month. It is the most carefully done meta-analysis I have ever seen on antidepressant drugs. It's very well done. It was done by Danish researchers, one of which is a coordinating editor in the Cochrane Collaboration, not in mental health. This is in liver diseases, but these people are very good, and they did a marvelous analysis that shows, once again, these drugs don't have any meaningful effects, and their harms outweigh any benefits there might be. If we had a decent system, these drugs would be withdrawn from the market now.
Peter, thank you so much for talking with me today. I'm really grateful to you. You were powerful in your description of a fundamentally broken treatment model, and I hope that it helps people make their own judgment based on hearing both sides of the story, rather than just the pharma-funded advertising and promotion of these drugs. Do you have any advice for anyone who wanted to stop taking their psychoactive prescription medication?
It can be dangerous to stop a psychiatric drug cold turkey. You must never stop abruptly. You should taper slowly, and you should get some help in doing that. That is the best thing. And we are actually now conducting courses about how to withdraw safely from psychiatric drugs. We will have the first course in Copenhagen in June, and there is also a course ongoing in Sweden in English, where a number of psychiatrists have volunteered and will come and listen and learn something about how they take people off psychiatric drugs.
It's incredibly heartening, Peter, to hear that this work is going on, because I know that it will help a lot of people in a similar position to myself, where I am taking a drug that gives me no benefit, causes me adverse effects, but fear of withdrawal is keeping me trapped. I'm really pleased that there are people putting effort into safely withdrawing patients from psychiatric medications.
Yes, we actually even created the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal last October, which is based in Göteborg in Sweden. Yes. So we now are establishing a charity in order to focus on this enormous drug disaster that the drug industry and all too willing psychiatrists have created.
Well, that is music to the ears of people like me, because we cannot put enough effort into this, and I'm glad that many psychiatrists are starting to become more flexible in their views about the validity of drug treatments for mental health conditions. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Gøtzsche. I'm really grateful to you for sharing your thoughts with me.
Well, we are grateful to you, James.
Well, thank you too for everything you've done, Peter. You are legendary in the community of people that really know the truth about these drugs. Thank you for being the flag bearer, and we owe you a huge debt of gratitude.
Oh, yeah. Thank you a lot, James. We can all help, and I have made my own website more active. I put more and more things up there, and I will, of course, tell people about your podcast also on my website, and then it will be disseminated via Facebook and Twitter and all sorts of things.
I'm so grateful to Professor Gøtzsche for giving up his time to talk to me. I hope you found his interview as engaging and enlightening as I did. And if you want to visit Peter's website, which I recommend, the address is www.deadlymedicines.dk. Feedback. Please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me on feedback@jfmore.co.uk. And I'd just like to read you this from a listener. They say, "These podcasts are essential listening for anyone who's had any contact with psychiatric medications. The user stories are powerful and the experts' views are eye-opening. Thank you so much for raising awareness of this. Please keep sending me your messages. It's really lovely to hear from you." I also wanted to let you know that I've created a Facebook group where you can discuss what you hear in the podcast. To find it, go to Facebook and search for Let's Talk Withdrawal. I'd love it if you wanted to be involved in the discussions there. Finally, if you are struggling with withdrawal yourself and don't know where to turn, there are some excellent resources listed on my website, jfmore.co.uk. Please go and have a look.
Please do not increase, decrease, or stop your psychoactive prescription medication without the advice and support of a medical or mental health professional.
Thank you so much for listening, and please come back next week for another episode. Until next time, take care.
Thank you so much for listening to Let's Talk Withdrawal. Come back next week for more news and views. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review and subscribe in iTunes.